time. So thank you very much. Let us now move to the third speaker, and I'm honored to invite Ambassador Chinoy, who is Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis of India. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, DAV, for inviting me to come to this conference. Let me walk you through very quickly the symbiotic relationship between diplomacy, defense, and deterrence, and also to relate what's happening in the South China Sea with our experience in the Indian Ocean and across the Himalayas. And perhaps there are some lessons there as well. We all recall what Adlai Stevenson, the US diplomat, had once said, that diplomacy is 1/3 alcohol, 1/3 protocol, and 1/3 geritol. Because that was an era in the 1950s when diplomacy was largely conducted by geriatric gentlemen in pinstriped suits. But that does not mean that we reject diplomacy. It still remains fundamentally important to the aims and objectives of realizing peace and security across the world. Diplomacy works even better when it is exercised in tandem with defense and deterrence. And look at some of the gems that we have here. You are aware that Theodore Roosevelt had once said, speak softly but carry a big stick. And I think that's wisdom there. We've also seen how the two American scholars, Giles Marlowe and George Myers, had once said, you have no idea how much it contributes to general politeness and pleasantries in diplomacy when you have a quiet little armed force in the background. And it changes the atmosphere when you speak from a position of strength. India's indigenous strategic thought encapsulated in the Arthashastra, written by Kautilya more than 2,000 years ago, also speaks of the importance of strong armed forces. When a state has strong armed forces, allies remain friendly and the enemy becomes friendlier. So there is a great deal of logic here in exploring the interconnectedness between diplomacy, defense, and deterrence. Of course, defense and deterrence are very expensive, but it's better to keep your powder dry, as they say. Now, let me very quickly say that the reason why diplomacy is not working very well in dispute resolution today is because of the failure of the multilateral order. And the multilateral order is failing because it refuses to change. It refuses to expand the United Nations Security Council. Privileged powers refuse to give up their privileges. And so you have a problem there. And geography is shrinking very rapidly because of the advent and march of technology. And in fact, the vast expanse of the oceans are no longer an impediment to military maneuvers, etc. And in our case, in the Indian subcontinent, the Himalayas are no longer a barrier to militarization, coercion, etc. of the type that India has experienced from time to time. So I can relate very much to the dispute in the South China Sea as a former negotiator of the India-China boundary dispute. I was the head of the negotiating team for 4 years between 96 and 2000. So I know a thing or two about dealing with salami slicing, about military coercion. But the importance of diplomacy cannot be understated. It's very important because I spent most of my life building confidence-building measures with our northern neighbor, entering into various agreements. But the problem is that these agreements are no good if the other side violates these agreements from time to time, and you have to start all over again. I'm so pleased to see that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping met yesterday in Kazan during the BRICS conference, and there is hope that there could be some kind of a reset, some disengagement, leading perhaps to a normalization of the situation in the India-China border areas. Now, I must also say here that the Indian Ocean is far from being very stable because we are seeing a number of new players coming in. There are a number of major powers that are traditional stakeholders. I would count the United States and the UK despite their mixed, historical past there, as traditional stakeholders, just as they are all traditional stakeholders in the South China Sea. The United States, France, Japan, they're all traditional stakeholders. And I'd say that some say that the entry of the People's Republic of China Navy, into the Indian Ocean is not a very traditional feature, because there's a gap of 600 years between Cheng He's voyages to the Indian Ocean and the plan coming into the Indian Ocean. Now, I want to also bring up very quickly in the limited time the relevance of UNCLOS. You'll all agree that that's the only agreement we have between the time that the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius wrote his brief trying to explain why the Dutch had to capture the Santa Catarina from the Portuguese, because the Portuguese were trying to speak of a mare clausum as against the Dutch advocacy of a mare liberum. Between then and 1982, you have no other agreement except in 1982, the UNCLOS. So let's all work to respect UNCLOS. But UNCLOS will work better if, for example, I would imagine the United States of America having actually got what it wanted in 1994 through the additional agreement, were to finally ratify UNCLOS. I think it would work better. I would also like to say that it's not just about the US not having ratified UNCLOS. There are implications there, because I see, for example, this huge scrimmage for seabed resources as another challenge, as another conflict arena, and the International Seabed Authority is an extension of UNCLOS. And because the United States of America is not part of UNCLOS except in terms of its respect for customary international law, it is also not part of the International Seabed Authority. And the International Seabed Authority has to deal with the emerging major power contestation for polymetallic nodules and rare earths and minerals at the bottom of the sea, what you call thermal vents and things like that. So I would personally believe that UNCLOS would be greatly strengthened. The International Seabed Authority would be greatly strengthened if the United States were to come in. The other feature is that things like freedom of navigation operations do not really restore status quo ante. So I would say they're very good, but they are conducted against friend and foe alike. So FONOPs are also conducted against the Philippines, against Indonesia, against India. But that probably comes from what a privileged power would tend to do. And I'm not criticizing that, but all I'm trying to say is that it does nothing to restore status quo ante. So you have a situation in the South China Sea that has come about as a result of a steady militarization in sharp contrast with earlier commitments by certain parties not to militarize the South China Sea, etc. Now, the problem gets more difficult today when there is a fusion of state and non-state. We are looking at state and non-state in Ukraine, in Gaza, but also in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, or the East Sea and the East China Sea. You are looking at fishing militia working in tandem with the Coast Guard working in tandem with structured naval forces, and that is a problem. And I would say that India, a country that has stood for peace and non-violence, has always advocated peaceful settlement of disputes. The Prime Minister of India has spoken on a number of occasions why there should be a preferred human-centric approach rather than going in for defense and deterrence, and all these things are very expensive. So diplomacy, selecting what you call a peaceful settlement of disputes kind of approach is something that India has always advocated. But even the great apostle of peace, that is Mahatma Gandhi, had said that if he had to choose between violence and cowardly flight, he would choose violence. And so therefore it's very important to ensure that diplomacy, defense and deterrence succeed, to stand your ground. If you wish to protect your sovereignty and territorial integrity, you have to be ready to shed blood if necessary. Peace is preferred, but you cannot, under the overhang of a desire for peace, get into an avoidance strategy. where there is a creeping militarization, a creeping change in the status quo, and that is most dangerous. Let me also very briefly in the next 50 seconds touch upon some of the dispute settlement aspects that we need to look at. In the Indian Ocean, for example, you have seen how the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea awarded, a very large chunk of territory in the dispute between the Maldives and Mauritius. The award went largely in favor of the Maldives, and the two sides have agreed to respect that, But you have the PCA ruling in the South China Sea that was not respected at all. And on the other hand, in the Indian Ocean, there was a dispute, for example, between India and Bangladesh, where the ruling went, the PCA award went in favor of Bangladesh, and we have completely respected that. So there are those that respect these tribunal rulings and those that completely ignore them, remain indifferent to these rulings. What strikes me is, again, the United States of America, strategic partner for India, for many of us here, a stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific. Why did it take the US full 4 years to align its own policy with the PCA ruling that went in favor of the Philippines? Between 2016 and July 2020, the US took the line that the PCA ruling was extremely legal in nature. The US was still studying it, and so on and so forth. And it took no sides on the territorial dispute. It's only in the dying days of the Trump administration that Secretary of State Pompeo, comes up with this huge change in July of 2020 and says that the US policy is now 100% aligned with the PCA ruling. So these things should come earlier, sooner rather than later. But let me end by simply saying that there are reasons why we must prefer diplomacy, minilateralism, plurilateralism, and that is where the quadrilateral security dialogue or the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative or the information sharing that we do in the context of the Indo-Pacific maritime domain awareness, all this comes in there. So let us have, resolute hope and faith in the power of diplomacy. It is dynamic today. It is no longer about alcohol protocol and geritol. There are many young people who work round the clock to diffuse tensions, and we must all work for peace and tranquility everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chinoy.
I think the greatest thing that ASEAN would have to guard against is this business of divide and rule on the periphery. That's a classic ancient stratagem, which in Chinese they would say, "Fan er zhi zhi." So, "Fan er zhi zhi" is a very, very important stratagem, and ASEAN would have to guard against this kind of divide and rule thing. The second point I want to very quickly make is in response to what the gentleman from the Philippines said. What I meant was that the United States of America generally is loath to take positions on territorial disputes in terms of who territory belongs to. But in this case, it was still the Trump administration that 4 years later actually aligned its position with the PCA ruling, which had actually debunked the so-called historical claims that a particular party was lining up against the Philippines. Now, we all know the story about Pai Mei-chu, who was the head of the China Geography Society in 1933, who was spooked by the French expeditions to several islands, particularly in the Spratlys, and who had then decided on drawing a certain map called the, humiliation map. And suddenly you have something called a 9-dash line, which was produced all of a sudden in 1936 for the first time. And before that, you had decades in which, for example, China was using terminology that was actually English terminology to describe, islands and things like that. So we have seen that kind of evolution of what is called history. And I'm experienced in this because we've seen some of that spill over across the Himalayas as well. A third point I want to make is about transiting through the Taiwan Straits. Now here, you know, the naval specialists might tell me, it's of course a very good thing, international waters, right of passage, right of innocent passage also. But the point is that the United States of America has not sent a carrier battle task force steaming through the Taiwan Straits since 2007. The last such visit was by the USS Kitty Hawk. I stand corrected if somebody knows better. After that, you have dozens of the other vessels like the Arleigh Burke class destroyers and all going in, including with, you know, planes and helicopters, but not a carrier battle task force. And Clinton had sent them twice, if you remember, during the Taiwan Straits crisis in the mid-90s. So it's good that Germany, France, you know, Netherlands, everybody is doing it. But has something changed? Why not a carrier battle task force? It going through the Pashi Strait is not the same as going through the Taiwan Strait. That's the other side. I think the last point I want to make is that, you know, India stands ready to work with like-minded partners at both, you know, bookends in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean to ensure that there is freedom of navigation and overflight and that sea lines of communication are greatly protected. The Indian Navy is, as you know, one of the biggest navies in the world, and we operate aircraft carriers. We build our own aircraft carriers. We build our SSBNs. We will be building our SSNs. So there is a fair bit that we can do, particularly in the, according to the Mandala theory, in the you know, immediate environs of the Western Indian Ocean and the Eastern Indian Ocean. And we are doing a lot with regard to, for example, the Red Sea, although not part of you know, the US-led operation in the Red Sea. We independently have deployed about 20 vessels. We are now, for the first time, an active member and participant in the Combined Maritime Forces. And that next year we will take on the you know, rotating chairmanship, leadership of Combined Task Force 150. So there's a lot that India does, in fact, as part of the Malabar exercises just concluded with the United States, with Japan and Australia. You know, these four countries are, it's not a naval alliance or a military treaty-based exercise, but more and more sophisticated platforms, including submarines and P-8I and anti-submarine warfare, and a lot of that is happening already between like-minded partners. The whole idea is to ensure that we are able to reject you know, arbitrariness and military coercion and flouting of international rules and regulations by whosoever you know, tries to transgress these institutional norms. Thank you.
Thank you very much.